Hey guys, so in today's video, we are going to be taking a look at why people hate Congress. And when I say hate Congress, I mean why they often get frustrated with the way that Congress functions and some of the more, not shady practices, but some of the questionable and more controversial practices that Congress is a part of, as well as public opinion. So those are all the things we're going to be taking a look at. Now, I want to start the video off talking about the incumbency advantage. And we started talking about this a little bit when we talked about the election process and campaigning and things like that. But just as a reminder, an incumbent is someone who is already holding office and is running for re-election. Now, as we've heard and know that there are no term limits in Congress. So there are 2-year terms in the House of Representatives and 6-year terms in the Senate. So yes, they only serve for those number of terms, but unlike the President of the United States, senators and House of Representative members are not banned from running again and again and again and again. So I'm assuming as you are looking at your profiles for your players in Fantasy Congress or those of your peers, you're probably seeing that there are quite a few Congress members that have been in office for quite some time. They would be considered an incumbent, and they have a huge advantage that we'll talk about in just a second in terms of running for re-election, and we'll look at why, like I said, in just a moment. Now, I wanted to talk about very quickly here just some data that I have from 2016. So these are showing you some of the data on the incumbents from that election. So in the House of Representatives, 393 of the 435 sought re-election. 380 won re-election. That is a total success rate of 97%, which is astronomically large. In the Senate, we see a very similar number, right? And similar results. 29 sought re-election, 27 won. That is a 93% total success rate of incumbents. And this process even goes down at the state level with governors as well. You can see 80% here. Now, part of the reason why people feel that the incumbency is an issue in Congress is that, and this cartoon kind of discusses this complaint, is that being an incumbent means that you have been rooted into the system through power and corruption, right? So this cartoon is arguing for term limits because, yes, it might look easy to uproot an incumbent, but in reality, they are rooted into the system. They're staying put by the corruption and power that has led them to that position. Now, some of the advantages that people, especially those in favor of a cartoon like the one from before, cite are something like franking privileges as an advantage. And this is ultimately really free postage, free mailing, free postage. And it's like, okay, who cares? But when it comes to running for an office, right, as we know, you have to campaign. As an incumbent, you are saving money because you don't have to pay for the mailing, the postage of all of those things that you have to send out to get your name out there for the rest of the world. So you also get free trips to your home district, your state. So you are already getting your name out there even more so than it already is. Now, as an incumbent, you also face weak and underprepared opposition oftentimes. Your opponents are often inexperienced at running campaigns in general. They might be unorganized, meaning they don't know what to use their funds for specifically. They don't know who to reach in terms of campaigning themselves. And they also are underfunded as well. And that gives us or gets us to another advantage of fundraising, right? It would be easier for you as an incumbent to raise money. You're a proven winner, right? You can take credit for the good things that you have done while you're in office. So you are going to be more likely to have money given to you by PACs, super PACs, individuals, citizens, etc., etc. Now, we've talked about this concept of log rolling in our last video on the bill to law process, but it is an advantage as well, right? As an incumbent, you can network. You know who's in office. You can exchange favors, reciprocally, vote for other bills in exchange for your bills to get voted on. And this then leads to continued claiming of, the good things that have happened while you are in office. Now, another advantage to being an incumbent, and especially an incumbent of the majority party, is something called gerrymandering. And I have more to come soon on this slide because I don't want to get into it right now because I actually have 2 slides here in just a second that we'll take a look at. But that is another advantage that comes with being an incumbent. Now, I want to talk about another reason why people get frustrated with Congress, and these are legislative add-ons. Now, there are things called pork barrel spending measures and earmarks. Now, these pork barrel spending measures are basically projects and grants of money that are collected for the sole purpose of bringing money into a representative's home district. And these funds of a bill are directed for a very specific purpose. For example, building a senior citizen center in a legislator's district. And then the spending that comes from that pork barrel legislation is an earmark or a rider. Okay. Now, members of Congress try to send these federal funds back to their home districts. And I know it's cheesy, but the quote is to bring home the bacon, so to speak, for the people that they represent. Now, something that really gets people frustrated is that often these pork barrel legislative measures and earmarks are often added in the last minute to avoid debate on them. Okay? Now, the constituents, obviously, who are in that legislator's district benefit, and they appreciate these earmarks and this spending, but that has led to a negative reputation. And as you might think, right, we've talked about riders before, right? These don't necessarily have to be specific to the original bill. So I have an example of pork barrel spending and earmarks here, and this is the case of the Bridge to Nowhere from Alaskan Senator Ted Stevens. Now, he originally had a bill whose primary purpose was to fund and provide armor for U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, he added a rider, or an earmark, to this bill that called for sending $400 million to his state to build a bridge to connect the Alaska mainland to an island with 60 inhabitants. So as you can see, this is bringing money back into his district, which is the state of Alaska, and it's not related to that original bill at all. So this is where a lot of people get frustrated with Congress's behavior. Right? And log rolling can also be considered a legislative add-on, right? Maybe not an add-on in the present sense, but in the future, right? You're trading those votes to gain support for a bill in the future. Now, another reason why people get frustrated with Congress would be intensifying partisanship and gridlock, which we've talked about quite a bit. Gridlock and then divided government. So I think this political cartoon kind of sums up this argument very well, right? What we did this summer by Congress, it's blank, the end, right? Not a lot seems to get done in the eyes of the public. Now, often when I'm talking about partisanship, right, it's this idea that people are so far right, so far left, no one can compromise, and we just stay stuck and nothing can get passed, especially in a divided government where the 2 chambers of Congress may be controlled by different parties, or maybe Congress in itself is one party, but the presidency is controlled by another. And this has led to bitter election contests, even bitter debate surrounding bills on the floors of the House and Senate, even between the president and Congress when it comes to executive orders, signing bills, and things like that. Now, something that has resulted from this that also gets people frustrated is something that is called party line voting, right? And people do this all the time, like we talked about in voting trends, but party line voting among Congress is more common than ever. So much so that straying from party positions has become dangerous for those interested in re-election, right? You want to prove that you stand with your party, otherwise you might fear not, or you might lose, being endorsed by someone of your party. Now, I want to talk about redistricting and gerrymandering. And redistricting and gerrymandering are often mistaken for the same term. They are not. They are related, but they are not the same. Now, redistricting itself affects only the House of Representatives, and so does gerrymandering as a result. But it only reflects the House of Representatives because it deals with population. And the House is the only chamber of Congress that deals with population. Now, Ultimately, redistricting is the reshaping of congressional districts every 10 years. And this is reflected based on the population changes determined by the census, which happens every 10 years. That's where that comes from. Now, this redistricting is done by state legislatures. Okay? Now, the party in power in the state legislature ultimately determines the new statewide map of congressional districts, and they draw those districts to benefit the party in power in the following election. So again, this has increased partisanship and decreased accountabilities in our state legislators and then ultimately in the House of Representatives. Now, how these districts are drawn by the state legislatures when they are redistricted has enormous impact on the makeup of the House of Representatives, as we will see in just a moment. Now, in the past, until the 1960s, the Supreme Court has refused involvement in issues of redistricting, okay? Remember when we talked about the judicial branch, the Supreme Court cannot take cases that are politically based, partisan based. They have to be that neutral, independent body of the government. But with Baker versus Carr in 1962, that changed. This opened the door for the Supreme Court to play a role in making legislative districts as democratic as possible. And this is where we get that one person, one vote doctrine, right? Where each individual has to be weighted equally in legislative apportionment when we are redistricting. And we will look at this case more in class, but I did just want to give you a quick refresher on one of our required cases. Now, this leads us to gerrymandering. And gerrymandering are those illogical district lines that are drawn to give the advantage to one political party over another. And this is called partisan gerrymandering. Now, what this does is we see the creation of safe seats and marginal/swing seats. Now, safe seats are gerrymandered districts where the party consistently wins by more than 55% of the vote. Okay, so in a district where Republicans win 55% majority of the vote, time after time, that would be considered a safe seat. Now, a marginal or swing seat would be parties where maybe that doesn't happen so often, right? The vote is closer than 55%. Okay, now, each party in Congress has more than 180 safe seats. That leaves 75 marginal seats up for grabs. And ultimately, with how many safe seats there are, this leads to almost certain victory for those incumbents or for candidates of the majority party of districts with those safe seats. Now, this lowers the incentive to compromise and raises the incentive to stick with the party doctrine or ideology. So as a result of the large number of safe seats, a vast proportion of Congress members fall far to the left or far to the right on that ideological spectrum that we've looked at. Now, partly because of that divide, when the congressional session is over, fewer policies that address and appease the vast majority of Americans who typically fall in the middle of the spectrum of ideology will ever get beyond a committee hearing, as we saw that is very frequent in the bill to law process. So I wanted to show you guys, this is from 2016, again, a little outdated, but this is both a hypothetical nonpartisan congressional district map of Ohio versus a gerrymandered Ohio. Okay, so as you can see here in the hypothetical nonpartisan congressional district, you can see that the predicted outcome would have been 6 Democratic districts, 1, 3, 5, 9, 11, 13, 9 Republican, okay, and then 1 toss-up. That would be like the marginal or swing. The rest would be those safe seats. Now, as you can see here, in comparison on the left, do you see how all of these districts here, these blue into this red even, how these are really weirdly shaped? Okay, that is an example of gerrymandering. So take a look. I think Cincinnati District 1 is a good example, right? We are District 1 in this lower corner, right? Hypothetically, right, because we are a large city, large cities tend to vote Democratic. Now, the Republican Party controls the state legislature in Ohio. So when this was drawn, you can see that the district of District 1 was gerrymandered to now become a Republican district. And this is our current map. So most districts in Ohio are now Republican. There are 12 Republican districts versus the 4 Democratic districts. So you can also see that the toss-up, or the swing seat, has also been taken over to now being a safe seat. Okay, now that brings us to our last topic here, which is racial gerrymandering. And racial gerrymandering is the intentional drawing of legislative districts on the basis of race. And first, this was used to dilute the votes of African Americans, especially during like Reconstruction and after the Civil War, and even through the 1950s and 60s. And this was found to violate the 15th Amendment voting rights that come with that amendment. And then in the more recent years, this racial gerrymandering has been used in what I want to say is like a well-intentioned, quote unquote, overcorrection of this original problem. Right, so instead of drawing districts based on race to discriminate against that particular race, we were seeing districts gerrymandered based on race to benefit that particular minority. So kind of think about it. I know we talked about affirmative action, right? Positive discrimination, right? This is kind of that same idea, but with drawing legislative districts instead. Now, no matter how neutral the gerrymandered district may be, ultimately this was found to violate the voters' rights to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And the case of Shaw v. Reno, which again, as I've said before, we'll look at in class along with Baker versus Carr, and we'll look at this gerrymandering process a little bit more. But this said that ultimately race must be held to the strictest of scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. So with this case, race ultimately cannot be used to discriminate against people in terms of drawing districts, and race cannot be the only factor that is used when considering drawing legislative districts. Okay, so you have to be very, very careful when it comes to drawing these districts. And like I said, we'll take a look at this in class. All right, so here are our summary questions for this section. So in your opinion, should there be term limits for Congress? And explain your thinking. And then how are reapportionment and gerrymandering related, right? They're not the same thing, so tell me, what is the relationship between them? And how do these concepts impact the election process? So make sure that you guys are writing down any questions that you have, and I will see you guys in class. Bye.